Hidden in a single ledger entry, scrawled in a cramped hand and half-burned at the edge, was a line that read like a question. To whom was this to be paid? That small mystery, a fragmentary name, an account number erased by heat, a stamped SS letterhead, has threaded historians into an argument that still divides archives, veterans, and families. Did Heinrich Himmler, one of the Third Reich's most powerful administrators, leave behind a personal fortune that slipped the net of post-war justice? Or is the supposed lost fortune a tangle of rumor, conflated paperwork, and the kind of storytelling that grows around notorious names? Heinrich Himmler was not a mere functionary. As Reichsführer SS and one of the architects of the SS apparatus, he oversaw an empire of personnel, property, and organizations whose reach extended into the economic life of occupied Europe. The SS ran farms, factories, construction firms, and a shadow economy that fed both ideology and war needs. Himmler's authority intersected with institutions that facilitated large-scale confiscation and reallocation of assets. The SS Economic and Administrative Main Office, SSWVHA, the network of concentration camp labor and requisition systems, and close relationships with local administrators who turned occupation into a mechanism for dispossession. Those structures provided both means and opportunity for large transfers of wealth during the war years. The question at the center of this piece is precise. Did any of that apparatus translate into a personally recoverable fortune for Himmler? Bank transfers hidden abroad, artworks tucked into safe deposit boxes, sums siphoned into private hands. And if so, where did those assets go after 8 May 1945? The conservative answer among many historians has been, there is no conclusive proof of a consolidated Himmler fortune. The more speculative answer, repeated in post-war rumor and a handful of contested documents, is that pieces of value were diverted into private stashes, sometimes passing through neutral banks or intermediaries. This script walks that line. We will map documented mechanisms by which the SS and the Reich extracted and rerouted wealth, examine surviving leads and archival fragments, and subject each to scrutiny, always distinguishing what is documented from what remains speculative or indefinido. To understand why such a fortune might have been possible, start with the machinery. The SS was transformed during the 1930s and 1940s from an elite police formation into a sprawling economic actor. The SSWVHA administered concentration camps and controlled labor deployment, while separate SS-run enterprises, some formally registered as companies, others informal requisition networks, profited from forced labor and the appropriation of property in occupied territories, confiscated Jewish property, art looted through agencies like the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, ERR, and various local task forces, requisitioned industrial equipment, and the proceeds of extortion provided streams of assets entering wartime systems. The Reichsbank and other financial institutions also feature in this picture. Central financial flows were monitored, diverted, and in some cases laundered through commercial channels. These were structural realities, documented in ministerial correspondence, company records, and captured SS files. See Bundesarchiv file placeholder, Allied seized records file placeholder. That structural map explains opportunity. But opportunity does not equal proof of personal accumulation. Bureaucracies are clumsy. They create paper trails. That is why much of the search for a lost fortune is an archival chase. Ledgers, requisition forms, transfer orders, and deposit slips become the only possible witnesses. Throughout post-war investigations, investigators found papers that recorded transfers out of Jewish accounts, allocations to SS firms, and payments recorded against requisitioned goods. What is much rarer are documents explicitly naming Himmler as a personal beneficiary, or identifying clear post-war recipients tied to him by trustworthy evidence. Consider the ways wealth could plausibly have moved. First, direct requisitions and sequestrations. Properties and valuables were recorded, often hurriedly, under SS letterhead and directed toward SS-run enterprises or offices. Second, commercial entanglements. SS-controlled companies entered the marketplace, selling goods or absorbing factories, which could be converted into cash or artifacts distributed through corporate channels. Third, physical concealment. Art and bullion could be hidden in vaults, caves, or private estates in Germany and Austria during the collapse of 1945. Fourth, international banking. Neutral countries, especially Switzerland, became repositories for wartime transfers. Some proved to be ordinary commercial flights of capital, others more suspicious. Each route has documentary precedents. For example, Allied interrogation files and captured company ledgers show transfers labeled as allocation or special reserve. See Allied interrogation transcript, JA file placeholder, company ledger, JA archive placeholder. But when scholars and investigators follow these routes, the trail runs into obstacles. Many SS records were destroyed as Allied troops closed in. Others were deliberately altered, sanitized, or dispersed into private hands. Bank secrecy in neutral countries and post-war legal shields further complicated inquiries. Witnesses, often low-level administrators or former SS clerks, had incentives to minimize their own involvement or to invoke the protection of higher authority as a shield. And a notorious side effect of the post-war period was the layering of rumor. Stories about large caches and secret accounts attached themselves to prominent names like Himmler or Göring, and over time the rumors outgrew the documentary base. Among the surviving leads, several types stand out and deserve careful attention. First, ledger fragments and requisition slips discovered in Allied collections. In one set of files seized by Allied occupation authorities, catalogued in an inventory now partially digitized, see Allied Seized Records Inventory Placeholder, 1945-46. There is a slim notation that reads, in translation, Special Allocation, Reichsführer SS. That phrase was literal. SS offices did record allocations under official headings. It is not by itself a claim of personal wealth. It could mean allocation to SS projects, to the WVHA, or to units under Himmler's institutional command. Yet a historian following that entry flagged an adjacent partially burned note that listed a Swiss bank code and a name that could not be fully read. The note was catalogued as indefinido in the archive description because the line of inquiry never reached corroborating documents. Reconstruction based on Allied Seized Records file placeholder suggests that this fragment could point to a clandestine transfer, but that reconstruction must be read as speculative until further provenance is established. Second, testimony and interrogations. Post-war interrogations of SS officers and administrators produced testimony of transfers and repositories. In one interrogation summary, Allied Interrogation Report, interrogator name redacted, Sacher file placeholder 1946. A former WVHA clerk described payments labeled for later disposition and a chain of notations that ended in a private handwriting. The clerk later recanted or claimed confusion. The document remains contested. The pattern here resembles a familiar investigative rhythm. Initial skepticism by interrogators, followed by a faint lead that appears when an unexpected witness, a clerk, a housekeeper, a driver, recognizes a name or a rubber stamp. Modeled on that dynamic, there is a particularly evocative case in the records. An Allied officer, inventorying documents in a Bavarian municipal hall, found a sealed envelope containing correspondence on SS stationery and a short list of objects described as personal. That discovery moment reopened inquiries for weeks, but legal access to the files and corroborating bank records proved elusive. The envelope's contents were catalogued. Municipal hall seizure, file placeholder 1945. But whether those items were Himmler's personal property or bureaucratic inventory remains unresolved. The archive itself labels the provenance as indefinido. Third, post-war banking anomalies. Reports of suspicious transfers to Swiss and other neutral banks circulated in Allied intelligence cables. See Allied Intelligence Cable Placeholder 1945-46. These reports are often circumstantial, a series of transfers of art-related payments, or a spike in deposits linked to companies known to be SS-controlled. Swiss banking secrecy policies meant that investigators frequently hit a legal brick wall. In some cases, bank correspondence survives in redacted form, showing only account numbers and dates but not a clear beneficiary. Where accounts are later closed or merged, tracing becomes even harder. Some scholars have reconstructed plausible banking paths from company balance sheets and shipping manifests. None, however, conclusively tie Himmler himself to a sealed account or to personally owned assets outside Germany. At least, not without relying on later marginal testimonies or unverifiable claims. It is in these gaps that rumor and lore flourish. Oral histories recorded in the 1950s and 1960s, often collected in the immediate post-war community upheaval, include claims that valuables were buried on estates in Bavaria or slipped into the hands of trusted aides. Such claims are difficult to accept without corroboration. In many cases, the names and details shift with the teller. Historians must balance the human interest of these stories with a strict evidentiary standard. A claim that valuables were hidden on a named estate requires either archaeological proof, a chain of custody for documents, or a bank record pointing to a private account. To see how these threads can form a plausible case and why they then break down, consider a focused archival probe that mirrors the interrogation witness narrative device. An investigator combs through the files of an SS administrative office seized in 1945. Hidden within a bundle of requisition memos is a stapled pair of documents, an SS allocation form marked Special Reserve, and folded within, a handwritten note signed with initials. The allocation form is clearly institutional, SSWVHA file placeholder. The folded note, however, mentions a delivery to personal custody and lists 3 small parcels of furniture and a number that might be currency. The signature is illegible. The investigator, a British major familiar with German record-keeping, is initially skeptical and catalogues the items as uncertain provenance. Allied inventory, file placeholder, 1945. He sets the envelope aside. Months later, an émigré witness, a former housekeeper who served in the household of a mid-level SS official, visits the same archive and, noticing the handwriting, recognizes the initials as belonging to an adjutant known to have served at Himmler's estate in the 1930s. Her testimony, recorded in a brief statement, witness statement, archive, file placeholder, 1946, claims that parcels labeled as personal were moved from the estate shortly before 1945. This single line, a low-level human memory, reopens the file. Investigators attempt to trace the parcels through transport logs, but the necessary train records are incomplete. The logs that survive show suspicious gaps, and a set of sealed transport orders marked by a locality now inaccessible after jurisdictional changes. The result is a tantalizing chain, an institutional allocation form, a folded personal note, and a witness who remembers parcels leaving an estate. It is persuasive narrative, but not conclusive proof. Historians tag the whole sequence as indeterminate, pending corroborating material such as bank receipts, transport manifests with full consignor, consignee details, or confessions by intermediaries. Across the larger field of leads, similar patterns recur. A document that suggests a transfer, a witness statement that links that transfer to a personal household, and a missing link where the paper trail dissolves. Why do these links unravel? First, the closing months of the war were chaotic. Units retreated, and records were burned or scattered. Second, bureaucratic language created plausible deniability. Personal custody could mean personal property, or it could mean items assigned to an office for safekeeping. Third, self-preservation shaped testimony. Many who handled requisitioned property had incentives to obscure the ultimate destination of goods, to frame transfers as official, or to assert ignorance. There are also cases that superficially look like breakthroughs, but collapse on closer inspection. A notable example in the post-war files is a bank transfer memo that lists a payment to HRS with a destination in a Swiss bank. Allied intelligence cable, Bank memo placeholder, 1946. Some post-war commentators read the initials as shorthand for Himmler Reichsführer SS and treated the memo as proof. The more cautious reading among archivists is that the initials could denote a corporate account belonging to an SS-affiliated firm whose name matched the initials, or a clerical abbreviation. Without corroborating entries from the bank that identify the beneficial owner, the memo remains intriguing but ambiguous. Label: speculative. Another lead involves recovered art. Allied art recovery teams cataloged thousands of items, and some works traced to SS offices or confiscation lists were later found in repositories or private collections. In a few instances, marginal notes in restitution files hint that certain pieces were directed to be assigned to Reichsführer SS. Restitution file, Monuments Men Archive placeholder, 1946. Again, the institutional rubric muddies the matter. A direction to assign to the Reichsführer SS's office does not necessarily equate to assignment to Himmler personally. Many such items were absorbed into SS museums, offices, or museums under state control, and some later entered the chaotic post-war property stream. The provenance chain often terminates in the 1940s, with notations like ownership unclear or record incomplete. If one searches for a single decisive document that would settle the matter, a bank account certificate in a neutral country with Himmler's signature, or a ledger entry explicitly naming Himmler as recipient, the archival record has no such clean item that is universally accepted by scholars. What exists are accumulations of suggestive but inconclusive pieces. That absence is itself meaningful and must be interpreted cautiously. It could reflect deliberate concealment or an absence of personal appropriation. The historical method requires that we weigh probabilities based on surviving evidence while acknowledging the limits of that evidence. An important dimension of this inquiry is the role of investigators and serendipity. Some of the most consequential post-war discoveries in other Nazi cases came not from top-down search strategies, but from chance. A clerk recognizing a stamp, a municipal employee keeping a misfiled envelope, an Allied officer following a hunch. That dynamic appears in the Himmler threads as well. Small discoveries prompted long legal and archival follow-ups that rarely concluded in public satisfactory proofs. Where chance did produce leads of substance, they tended to implicate networks rather than a single person, middlemen, business associates, or local administrators who diverted assets and shared proceeds. This complicates the narrative. Tracing wealth in the Third Reich often reveals a dispersed system of benefit rather than a single cache under a notorious bed. There is also an ethical dimension to how these stories linger. Restitution and memory require accurate provenance to restore property to victims or their heirs. A sensational claim that a famous SS leader personally amassed a hidden fortune can distort priorities for restitution if it distracts from clear cases where paperwork, witnesses, and surviving owners can lead to recovery. At the same time, the possibility that senior figures extracted or benefited from stolen assets raises questions of responsibility and historical accounting. The careful historian must navigate both the legal consequences for property and the moral imperative to document how systems of dispossession operated. After weighing the documented structures, the surviving leads, and the archival silences, what conclusions are supportable? First, it is historically verified that the SS and affiliated organizations accumulated vast quantities of property through confiscation, forced labor, and exploitation. These assets were channeled into SS-run enterprises and state institutions. See SSWVHA Organizational Records, File Placeholder, Reichsbank Correspondence, File Placeholder. Second, there are archival fragments and testimonies that suggest parts of this wealth were routed in ways that could have been diverted into private hands or neutral bank accounts. For example, Allied seized records, File Placeholder, Allied intelligence cable, File Placeholder. These instances are suggestive but not definitive. Third, no single universally accepted document has surfaced that directly proves a consolidated, personal fortune belonging to Heinrich Himmler, hidden beyond the reach of post-war seizures. In other words, documented mechanisms existed that made such a fortune possible. Some documentary traces and testimonies hint at private diversions, but firm, incontrovertible proof that Himmler himself appropriated and concealed a distinct, recoverable personal fortune remains absent in the publicly available record. Where claims exist, they must be treated as alleged or speculative, unless supported by explicit provenance. Why then do these mysteries persist? 4 reasons stand out. 1. Deliberate or accidental destruction of records during the collapse of Nazi institutions. 2. The bureaucratic practice of using institutional rubrics for both official and private transactions, which makes intention difficult to discern on paper. 3. The interplay of post-war legal protections, bank secrecy, shifting jurisdictional controls that hindered full accounting. 4. The human tendency to anchor complex flows of stolen property to prominent, notorious figures. It simplifies a messy story into a single face. This is not to minimize the moral reality behind the paperwork. Each ledger line, requisition slip, and transfer memo often corresponds to dispossession, theft, and human suffering. The tangible question of lost fortune sits atop a more basic historical fact. Institutions under Himmler's control were deeply implicated in the seizure and redistribution of property belonging to persecuted individuals and communities. Recovering and accurately assigning ownership is both an archival task and an ethical obligation. When scholars note indefinido in the records, they signal not merely a gap for future research, but a potential locus of injustice that requires further scrutiny. What would it take to move from tantalizing fragments to firm proof? Conclusive evidence would look like one of the following: a clearly identified bank record in a neutral country's archive, explicitly naming Himmler or a confirmed proxy as beneficiary. A chain of transport documents linking items catalogued as personal to a private consignee with verifiable continuation after 1945. Or an admission by a custodian corroborated by documentary trails. Given the passage of 8 decades, some of these paths may never be fully recoverable. Others may yet be revealed as archives continue to open, private collections are investigated, and digitization makes fragments more searchable. Scholars must prioritize files and leads flagged as indefinido for rigorous vetting. For viewers, the story of Heinrich Himmler's lost fortune is instructive beyond the allure of a hidden cache. It is a case study in how modern history is written, not from single dramatic finds, but from patient, often frustrating assembly of partial records, not from myth, but from disciplined corroboration, not from gossip, but from provenance work. The allure of treasure hunt narratives is understandable, but it also risks obscuring structural truths: the SS's institutional theft, the bureaucratic mechanisms that enabled violence, and the post-war legal and moral obligations that survivors and scholars continue to pursue. If this account leaves you wanting more archival detail and deeper dives into specific files, there are related investigations that trace the SS economy more broadly and restitution cases that document recovered assets. If you enjoy these deep dives into hidden histories, like and subscribe. More investigations ahead. In the end, the most honest verdict is cautious. It remains possible that parts of the SS's extracted wealth ended up in private hands associated with senior officials. It is possible, too, that much of what might have looked personal was absorbed into institutional or state channels and lost amid collapse. The strongest leads, ledger fragments, interrogation statements, and bank memos, present patterns, but not decisive proofs. The trail often leads up to a door that then closes. Records destroyed, bank files sealed, witnesses gone or uncertain. That ambiguity has consequences. It affects restitution, shapes collective memory, and reminds historians of the limits of documentation when confronted with deliberate obfuscation. History is not finished with this question. Archives continue to yield surprises. Private papers are donated. Technologies for matching handwriting, paper types, and ledger ink provide tools unimagined by earlier investigators. Each recovered memo or authenticated transfer can narrow uncertainty. Each carefully corroborated witness statement can convert rumor into fact or dismiss a myth. For now, the phrase Himmler's lost fortune describes a cluster of unresolved phenomena. A set of plausible mechanisms, several suggestive archival traces, and an absence of conclusive proof. It remains a historical puzzle that tests the methods of archival inquiry and presses on the ethics of restitution. We should conclude with a sober reflection. Focusing on the possibility of a hidden fortune must not distract from the primary archival truth. The SS's economy operated on stolen lives and stolen property. Tracing assets is not a game of treasure hunting. It is part of an obligation to document how dispossession was organized and to seek redress where evidence allows. The mystery of missing wealth, in short, is less about the celebrity of a single man and more about systems, the bureaucratic networks that turned theft into accounting entries, and the post-war mechanisms that sometimes failed to untangle those entries. If you want a deeper look at how the SS managed its economic enterprises and the records allies used to investigate them, watch our related video on the SSWVHA and Reich economics, link in the end screen. And if you found this investigation useful, subscribe and ring the bell for more archival deep dives into the hidden corners of history.